Hello again. Today we are talking about multiplication properties, okay? If you saw my last video, we talked about addition properties, and we talked about the commutative property, we talked about the associative property, and we talked about the identity property. And those were all properties of addition. But now we're talking about multiplication properties. And there is a commutative property of multiplication, an associative property of multiplication, and an identity property of multiplication. The commutative property of multiplication says that numbers can be multiplied in any order. Like 5 times 3 is equal to 3 times 5. For instance, 9 times 2 is equal to 2 times 9. And 3 times 11 is equal to 11 times 3. And that's the commutative property of multiplication. The associative property of multiplication works just like the addition property. So if I have 2 times 3 times 4, and that's equal to 2 times 3 times 4, if there are parentheses around the 2 and the 3, and then on the right side, there are parentheses around the 3 and the 4. Those are equal to each other. Just make sure that the numbers are in the same order, and then you'll be able to group it however you wish. And that's the associative property of multiplication. Now, the identity property of multiplication is a little bit different. The identity property of addition was when you add 0, the number keeps the same value. Well, with multiplication, if I have 5 and I multiply it by 1, I still have 5. So 1 multiplied by any number still gives us that number. And that's the identity property of multiplication. Now, there's another property in multiplication that we need to talk about. It's called the zero property. The zero property of multiplication says anything times 0 is 0. So if I have 6 times 0, that's 0. Or if I have 8 times 0, that's still 0. So that's the zero property of multiplication. So here I have my properties of multiplication. And let's say they ask us to use properties to complete an equation, okay? So if I have 2 times 9 equals 9 times something, which property does that look like? I'd say that's the commutative property. And the commutative property says I can multiply any numbers in any order. And so what number is missing? Well, 2 is missing. Matter of fact, that's pretty much the example that I gave right there. So here I have 5 times something equals 5. So what can I multiply 5 by and still get 5? Well, that's the identity property. Matter of fact, that's the example I gave right there. 5 times 1 equals 5. So here I have 0 times 13 equals 0. Which property is this? Well, it has a 0 in it and it equals 0. So I would say that it is the zero property. If I have in parentheses 6 times 5 times 7, and I have 6 times parentheses 5 times 7, what property is this? Well, notice that the associative property has a group of 3 numbers on each side of the equation with parentheses on each side. And all the numbers are in the same order. They're just grouped a little differently with the parentheses. And so that would be the associative property. Here I have 1 times 3. So any number times 1 is itself. And that's the identity property. So I would say that this is identity. So here I have in parentheses 5 times 3 times 8. And that is equal to 5 times parentheses 3 times something. Well, notice I have parentheses on both sides. So I'm going to say that that is the associative property. And remember, the associative property always has the same numbers on either side of the equation. So here I have a 5, a 3, and an 8. So here I should have a 5, a 3, and an 8. So an 8 is what is missing. So this is the associative property, and an 8 was missing. And that's how you use the multiplication properties.